Welcome to Sabbath Collective, a community of people interested in celebrating the Sabbath and pursuing God through a Hebraic worldview of the Bible. And again, sorry we're a little late tonight. We had some internet glitches last minute. So we're going to continue with Psalm 23, and we are on the last part of this series. And this is a Psalm of David, and it has some really profound practical things that we've been walking through. And tonight we're going to talk about really probably the most common part. But let's look over the whole psalm first. A psalm of David. Adonai is my shepherd, I lack nothing. He has me lie down in grassy pastures. He leads me by quiet water. He restores my inner person. He guides me in right paths for the sake of his own name. Even if I pass through death-dark ravines, I will fear no disaster, for you are with me. Your rod and staff reassure me. You prepare a table for me, even as my enemies watch. You anoint my head with oil from an overflowing cup. Goodness and grace will pursue me every day of my life, and I will live in the house of Adonai for years and years to come. So again, this is the very last part, and it's probably the most practical for us. You prepare a table for me, even as my enemies watch. Let's look at that again, because it's really pretty profound. You prepare a table for me, even as my enemies watch. And why would that be important at all, that the enemies are watching as the table is prepared? So it's really interesting. David is referring here to the high summer range we spoke about last week. And these areas were hard to reach, but great grazing with nutrient-dense green, which makes for healthy sheep. And as the sheep were led into this ravine, so it was this ravine, as we talked about, that was kind of in the dark because the mountains sort of blocked out a lot of the sun, mountains on both sides, the water and the grass in the ravine, and the shepherd is leading them through this. And they are completely exposed and out in the open. Getting to the good water and the good grass could really feel dangerous. Now, I'm going to talk tonight a lot about these Hebrew words because they're really important, and we lose a lot in translation in the English. But the Hebrew word translated prepare is the verb arak, and it describes arranging or ordering in anticipation of the guests. So if you maybe have a hospitality leaning, or possibly somebody in your family, you know that when you have company, there's a lot of sort of meticulous preparation that goes into preparing the table and the environment for guests. And this is this Hebrew verb arak. And it has a much deeper meaning than just prepared. It really means it's a meticulous ordering and arranging. The word for table in Hebrew is the word shulchan, and it refers to a king's table with this beautiful spread. The shepherd actually goes before the sheep, and he picks out all the poisonous weeds or the bitter weeds in the fields before them, and he puts salt and minerals down so that the ranges would be even more nutrient dense. So this was quite literally preparing the table. And then he brings the sheep to this table of prepared nourishment. And this is this concept that we have for us as the shepherd. He prepares it for me, David says. And this is the Hebrew phrase panim, which means face to face. And it's a Hebraic concept of nothing in between. Face to face means, I don't know about you, but when I go to a nice restaurant, I love the kind of restaurants where you can see the chefs, right? And when Matthew and I go out, we always just like to sit at the bar where we can see the chefs prepare. And this is this concept of panim. There's nothing separating the sheep from watching the shepherd prepare. He doesn't sneak off into the back room somewhere. He does it right in front of the sheep. Face to face means the sheep are watching the shepherd and they see his hands. And as we've been saying every week, the shepherd does all these things to provide for the sheep. But the sheep need to be aware. The sheep need to watch and see him in order to trust and follow him. And that's a really important concept. This is two sides of the same coin. Yes, the shepherd does miraculous things, but in order for the sheep to follow him, they've got to trust him, which means they've got to see. The text goes on, in the presence of my enemies. And this is the part that I'm really excited about. I kind of saw it in a new way when I was preparing this. The sheep's enemies are predators, and they would hide in the mountains over the top, watching over them. So again, the sheep are going through this ravine, and the enemies are literally standing over top of them, watching them, hiding. And the Hebrew word neged here, in the presence, it does mean in front of. So the shepherd is preparing this table in front of the enemies. But it also means opposite or against. In other words, neged can imply a confrontation of sorts. So what does that mean? Let me give you a real life example of this. About 20 years ago or so, when I lived in Brooklyn, there was a woman that I knew who was really being abused. And she was abused by the father of her children horribly, and he abused the kids too. And we were trying to help her, encourage her to get an order of protection, to get him away from her family. And he kept telling her, you can't make it without me, you need me. So he was a predator. He was really an enemy. And he would watch her wherever she would go. He would stalk her. He would just tell her that she absolutely couldn't survive without him. And so what we who loved her and wanted to support her started to do was we started to come by. Finally, she got an order of protection. We went with her. She got an order of protection, and he moved in down the street into his brother's house. And so he could still see her, but he wasn't allowed to come to the house. So what happened was we would come up, we would pull up with our van, and we would drop off food to her. Or we would pick her up and the kids up, and we would take her out for her errands. And he would see that. Now, this is this concept of neged. So we were taking care of her. We were preparing things for her. And we were doing it in the presence of an enemy, neged. So not only was it done in front of him, but it was also done opposite or against him. This concept of neged is actually the shepherd's provision counters the enemy's threats. So when it's done in front of the enemy, it's not only for the sheep, it also counters the enemy himself, which is really cool. Now, Middle Eastern culture is all about hosting, as you probably know. The meal is a place of hospitality. And not only do you feed your guests, you protect them with your life. But here, the situation would be completely shocking to the ancient reader of this, the ancient Hebraic reader of this poem, this song. No one would think of preparing a meal in the presence of your enemies. Meals are for families and friends and business associates or allies, not those who seek your harm. And on top of that, a few weeks ago, we talked about resting and digesting. We talked about fight or flight and high beta brain waves and all of that. And we mentioned that you cannot rest and digest when you're in that high beta brainwave state, that fight or flight response. And so it was impossible for sheep to rest and to digest when they're in flight or fight. So how can sheep recline and relax? How can they eat? And again, when we think of this the Jewish perspective of eating together, remember in the Middle East in this time, and still today even, they would sit down on the dirt. Well, not the dirt, they had beautiful blankets. And then they would recline. And it would be this really slow, loving, warm time together where they would eat and they would relax. How could they do that if they were nervous? They must be at peace. The sheep had to have been at peace to be able to eat. The sheep eat as the enemies watch. Nothing is hurried. There is no fear or chaos. The sheep are in this present moment in the shepherd's care. They're not in the what ifs time, which, by the way, the what ifs are always behind us in the past or in the future, right? They're never present. So they are in the present moment. They're not in the what ifs moment, and they're not even in tomorrow's what ifs. The shepherd has them. So what do the sheep say to death? Not today. How many times have we asked God to remove our enemies or remove us? Let me see a thumbs up or a comment if this is kind of really clicking with you here. How many times have we asked God to remove our enemies? God, please get these enemies away from us. Move them someplace else. Or remove us, move me. And this is the picture of doing neither, but of being in safety. See, the shepherd brings these sheep because it's the best place for them in the presence of the enemies while the enemies are watching, and he gets them to a state where they're so safe, so secure that they can eat from this table he's prepared for them. Have you ever thought of your enemies in that way? With all of our asking, remove, 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 or move me. Sometimes the shepherd might say, you know what? I'm going to have you here, and I'm going to take care of you in the presence of your enemies as they watch. We're with the shepherd. And even in the midst of our enemies as they watch, there's perfect peace. It's a trust that supersedes even a survival instinct. So let me ask you this. Do you think you can do that? Can you keep your eyes on the shepherd and not on the hidden enemy? Or do you find yourself always looking around for that enemy and missing what the shepherd is doing? And this is a really cool picture of how the shepherd guides us into a place that is in the presence of our enemies, and he takes care of us there. The Hebrew word for enemy is actually the word sarar, and it's a really interesting word, sarar. And it has to do, sorry, I think I just missed a comment. It has to do with, okay, hey Alex, good to see you. Hey Nicole, great to see you. Lupita, hey, Shabbat Shalom. Phoebe, Mikkel, good to see you as well. And the word sarar, the Hebrew for enemy, is certainly about an adversary or an oppressor. In other words, it is definitely about an oppressor. But it also has this form where it takes on the nuance of being bound or being distressed, of being confined or being troubled. Alex says, I was thinking about something similar while biking these past 2 weeks. It's amazing how if you see an obstacle and focus on it, you're more likely to hit it than if you focus on the path. Yeah, Alex, definitely. You know, they do that. I've talked about this a few times. They do this when they teach you how to drive in those racing tracks. You know how they let novices go in and drive, and what they tell people when they get in is don't look at the barrier, because wherever you look is where you're going to steer. And they do it with bike racing as well. It's really interesting. And this is a case exactly that we should be looking at the shepherd. What we see and choose to focus on is the place we actually end up. No question about it. So this word sarar is definitely an adversary, definitely an oppressor, but it also means being bound, being distressed, being confined, and being troubled. In other words, this Hebrew word for enemy has two kind of meanings. It's enemies from the outside. And then there are enemies that distress and bind us inside. And sometimes that's the voice of our mother, or the voice of our husband, or the voice of our friend, or our coworker that constantly plays in our head. And this preparation of the meal by the shepherd, this eating together, what the shepherd has prepared while the enemies watch, is a sign of covenant. In life, we will most definitely have enemies. And oftentimes they're not even deserved. We didn't even do anything to deserve them as an enemy. But the preparation and protection of this covenant will not be affected by those things that may be against you. And that is extremely encouraging. You anoint my head with oil from an overflowing cup. You anoint my head with oil from an overflowing cup. So the shepherd is keeping the sheep. He's keeping them safe. There's good grazing. There's good water. And now there's a fly in the ointment, so to speak. There are numerous insects that emerge in hot weather. There's botflies, there's mosquitoes, and other flying pests and parasites. And they can turn paradise into torment. The nosefly deposits its eggs in the nasal membranes. And then the eggs hatch in a few days and form a worm-like larva that work their way up into the sheep's head. That's awful. And sets up this intense irritation and inflammation. And for relief, the sheep will actually beat his head against a rock or a tree. There's also skin conditions that sheep can get from other sheep. But the shepherd will always keep an antidote of ointment handy, and that's made with olive oil and sulfur and spices. And at the very sight of these flies or these skin problems, he smears this all over the sheep's nose and the sheep's head and anywhere he sees a potential problem. And it is immediate relief and immediate results. And here's the thing, and you may have known this, you may have figured this out. Hey, Josh, Shabbat Shalom. Good to see you, honey. It can be the small things in our life, the petty nuisances that can drive us to distraction. Here's all these enemies that are lurking in the mountains, and we're talking about that, and we're thinking about that. But also it talks about this oil that the shepherd used. And the oil is for the smaller distractions of the sheep that can cause them to only be focused on that. Solomon 2:15 is one of my favorite verses. It says, "Catch the foxes for us. Yes, the little foxes. They are ruining the vineyards when our vineyards are in bloom." And what that speaks of is what happens was they would have a watcher that would stay in a kind of tower on the vineyards, the wine vineyards, and they would look for birds and they would make sure that the grapes were okay. But what they couldn't see right when everything was blooming, because it was so dense, what they couldn't see from up top with the big picture was what was going on in the roots underneath. And these little foxes would come and gnaw on the vine, right? And they would undermine the vine. And they didn't know that the foxes were at work until the fruit on the vine started to die. So Solomon 2:15 says, "Catch the little foxes because they're ruining our vineyards." And again, this is the work that goes underneath, this little nuisances that can really be a distraction. It's the little things that can get to us sometimes. But the shepherd sees and he knows. The word anoint is not the Hebrew word mashach, which is most commonly used, actually. But it's the word dashan. And that means to grow fat, to become prosperous, to make healthy, to take away the ashes or grief. You remember in this time when they were in mourning, the Israelites would put ashes on them when they were in mourning. And this word dashan, which is anoint, takes away the grief. And it makes one prosperous. The word revaya, translated overflows, means saturation. So this pouring of overflowing oil saturates us and makes us whole. And here's the thing, and give me a thumbs up if you find this to be true too, or even share what you felt about this. This pouring of overflowing oil that saturates us and makes us whole, we sometimes resist this experience of saturation healing. Instead, we just kind of get a few drops and we think, okay, that's good, that's enough. I got people to see, places to go, and things to do. But that quick relief is sometimes only temporary. It's situational. Maybe we feel good and then something else hits us and we plummet right away and we say, oh my gosh, I thought I had peace. I thought I had wholeness. What happened? Why do I keep losing it? What's the difference between something that's in us and something that's on us? Because this speaks of a saturation at the cellular level. You may be able to see this, but I'm tan. I live in Florida. So I look, light tannish, right? I'm tan on the outside. This tan is not actually part of me. Now, if somebody would see me, they would say, oh yeah, Donna has color. She's not real pasty. She has color. That's the me that they would see now, right? But if I come out of the sun for even 4 days, I turn into the white pasty Donna again. So you see, this color is not actually really in me. It's externally outside of me in a sense because I can't keep it. So this is the same kind of situation. To have something that's in abundance, an abundance of healing that comes from the shepherd, it goes to the cellular level. And it's in abundance, it doesn't leave us. So no matter what we go through, we have this wholeness that's with us. And that's this oil that is poured on us that the shepherd gives us. Goodness and grace will pursue me every day of my life, and I will live in the house of Adonai for years and years to come. Goodness and grace will pursue me every day of my life, and I will live in the house of Adonai for years and years to come. The word for goodness is the Hebrew word tov, and it means pleasant or useful or efficient or beautiful, kind, right, and morally good and just. And the word for grace is the word chesed, which means mercy, grace, and loving kindness. Goodness and grace radaf me. To run after in hot pursuit is what that word means. So goodness and grace run after me in hot pursuit. If it were me and I was the sheep that David was talking about, I'd be thinking about those enemies that were up in the mountains once the shepherds started taking us. I'd be thinking about what they were up to after that nice dinner I had with the shepherd. And I'd be looking behind me to see if they were following me or not. And every little sound I'd say, oh, is the enemy behind me? Is that him? But what does David say that pursues him? Not the enemies. The sheep are not followed by evil, by those enemies that are jealous of you or want to devour you, or want to destroy you. The sheep are followed, are hotly pursued by goodness and grace. And that goodness and grace has your back. And lastly, I will live in the house of Adonai. And by the way, that doesn't mean a building, right? It doesn't mean a building. It actually speaks of having lifelong intimate connection with the shepherd. You will always be at home with God. You will never be deserted. The shepherd has promised that. Hebrews 13:5 says, for God himself has said, I will never fail you or abandon you. Whether through the green pastures, the still waters, through death dark ravine, or in the presence of my enemies, I know he is always with me. So I will have no fear on the path. And that is an incredible thought. This is the song that David sings. And again, David's been through a lot. Seeing the shepherd turns hunger into satisfaction, fear into security, and separation into connection. Hunger into satisfaction, fear into security, and separation into connection. And that's the promise that we have as sheep from the shepherd. And this is not only good for the sheep, but if sheep are shepherded well, listen to this, they leave the place that better than when they found it. Okay? They leave the place better than when they found it. The shepherd's care coupled with the sheep that see and follow, it changes everything. We're going to close this time with the lighting of the Shabbos candles. And traditionally, the mother of the home lights the Sabbath candles, and they symbolize the light of joy and of peace and of unity. And then she encircles her hands around them 3 times as a gesture that welcomes in the Sabbath. The Lord is our shepherd, our guidance, and our salvation. May his love and light be felt in this time as the enlightenment of truth and the radiance of joy. Amen. And if you're watching this later, which most do, I encourage you to write comments. I read them and other people do as well. Turn on your notifications so you can read the comments of others, and I'll always respond back. Shabbat Shalom.